After dumping heavy rain on islands in the eastern Caribbean, Tropical Storm Ernesto is on a path that would just skirt Jamaica. National Hurricane Center forecaster Michael Brennan.
Our forecast has the center of Ernesto passing near or south of Jamaica as we get into late Sunday. And then after that time, we expect more of a turn toward the west-northwest.
People in Kingston have been stocking up on supplies. Sandy Kozel, AP Radio News.
Man, hurricane season, right? Every year since I was a kid. But that's the way it goes, right? Every year forever, I suppose. But now they're getting worse because of global warming, which in many parts of the country doesn't exist for people. I wonder if the people who are fundamentalist Christians or people who listen to Fox or whoever these people are who don't believe in global warming and maybe also believe in Santa Claus at the same time. All the people out in the Midwest, sometimes who are in the mega churches who don't believe in global warming, I wonder what they think now that their crops are actually failing, that it's a new dust bowl out there. I mean, does that change people's minds? I bet it does change people's minds. Unless they think that they somehow wronged God, that they committed sins and God is angry at them. I suppose that's always possible. Anyhow, this is Mike Fader on Sirius XM Left 127. Did I get that right? Oh, it's a lot of words. I got that right. Okay. We may or may not have a guest this hour, and we're seeing if we can get in touch with him. But at 6 p.m., we're going to speak to Chip Burley, who is a well-known researcher, investigator, and writer about hate groups in the United States, right-wing groups, and the connection to violence. We're going to analyze some more of this kind of gun violence that goes on in this country and the kinds of people who do it, what they represent culturally and maybe even politically, but essentially culturally. I mean, why they aren't really lone gunmen, where they come out of a deep American root, especially a particular kind. So we're going to do that at 6 p.m. after the 6 o'clock news. And then at 7 p.m., we're going to talk to a guy who's a broadcaster and also a political activist who lives in West Virginia. And he's going to talk about mountaintop coal mining. And he really has the goods on everything down there. This is the guy who knows all about what's going on down there. West Virginia is essentially becoming a dead state, like a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that the, British Petroleum and other places have actually created a dead zone of, hundreds of square miles in Gulf of Mexico where nothing can live because they poison the whole place. And who knows how long that'll go on, right? I don't know, 10 years, 20 years, a century. But what's happened in West Virginia is a similar thing on land. The coal mining industry, especially mountaintop coal mining, have blown off the tops of mountains and just, let them cascade into valleys and rivers, and the pollution, the cancer rate, everything down there. Basically, they're turning it into a dead zone in West Virginia. Only, there's actually people living there and animals and vegetation. Well, there were before. So we're going to talk about this and if there's anything to be done about it. And that'll be after 7 o'clock. Let's see a few things. I'd like you all to go to a Facebook page. I have a Facebook page created, and we have political discussions on this Facebook page, cultural, political discussions, mostly politics. And it gets very heated, and it's also very interesting. People post videos on there. We have debates. I'm having a long-running, pretty articulate, interesting debate with people about voting third party, where basically I'm I'm in a minority. I'm being kicked and pummeled by the more intelligent, persuasive listeners who are writing long essays and telling me how wrong I am and how I'm making a terrible mistake by pushing for a third party. So, but this goes on there. It started out, this is called Occupied Territory. So how you get there on Facebook is you, and I don't understand Facebook all that well. I mean, after all, I'm an old guy. What do I know? But I guess anybody could go on Facebook. You don't have to be a friend of a Facebook page to actually look at it. I don't think you can do things on it unless you're a friend, but I don't really understand Facebook. However, you can go there and take a look at it. And if you like it, you can friend it, you can like it, whatever. And you can participate in the discussion, which is fine, because you'll get a lot of interesting, I write essays on it. There's running, sort of written arguments on it. There are videos that people post. There are interesting, articles that people post on it. So it's called Occupied Territory. Occupied Territory. And it started out with being about the Occupy movement, but it has soon become sort of a larger, more expanded website page. or Facebook page that includes every kind of political discussion, economic discussion about, international affairs, whatever, domestic stuff. So go there as soon as you get a chance or whenever you get a chance and participate in that. Also, Sam, who lives in Anchorage, Alaska, one of our listeners here, writes and he says, if you didn't know, and you know what, Sirius XM has an internal, I don't know what, they have an internal mass email for the employees here, especially for people who work on the air, to get information about what's going on Sirius, on the other channels, or what's happening. And of course, there's stuff about like what's happening corporately, like the Christmas party, everybody will have to wear a parachute and jump off the top of the building, or whatever it is. They give you notifications. And I'm supposed to check on this every few days to see what's new. In other words, we don't get personal memos too much here because it's a huge organization, and they ask us all to go and check this. And the last time I checked it was, 1961. So I rely on the listeners to let me know about things. So Sam from Alaska writes in, if you didn't know, SiriusXM updated their iPhone app today, and they added an on-demand and download feature for select shows. The select shows are basically those produced by Sirius, I suppose, as opposed to XM. I don't know. Anyway, my last four Saturday shows are listed, and they can be listened to on demand or downloaded to the phone for listening later. Commercial free, by the way, it says here. Another nice feature is the listed shows have a detailed synopsis of who the guests were, which comes from my producer, who's right here, and what the main show topics are. Interesting. Did you know that? So now you're on iPhone and iPad? You know that. Okay. At the end of the synopsis, the last sentence says, be sure to visit Mike Fader's website at faderfiles.com. Yes, be sure to do that. Okay. Thank you, Sam from Alaska. And what's that, 3 weeks ago, somebody was calling up, a lot of truckers listen to the show, and somebody was calling up saying something about, they were very angry. A woman called up, who's a woman trucker, who was angry about a lot of companies now are putting cameras in the cabs of trucks to check up on people, and she was very angry about that. And here's a response to that. I encourage responses. Anytime I get an email, I respond to it, unless, of course, you believe the world is created in 7 days or whatever, then I don't usually respond. But otherwise, I respond to most emails. And so this woman was complaining about it, and it did seem like a violation of people's individual privacy rights. Nevertheless, this guy writes, he's also a trucker, I guess. Let's see what he says. Hi, Mike. I was listening to a show in the hollows of West Virginia. Coincidence, because we're going to talk about these places later. When a woman called to complain about the requirement for trucking companies to install electric onboard recording devices. And I didn't get a cell signal, and so I couldn't refute the information. Anyways, she calls to complain about the government requiring electronic onboard recorders for the heavy-duty trucking industry. Then she goes on to complain about the possibility of video recorders in truck cabs. The onboard recorders are to prevent truck drivers driving more than 12 hours a day. The instruments will require the driver to punch in a code. It will then record the amount of time the truck is driven by that driver. I guess it would also find out that the driver wasn't driving enough hours, although I can't imagine any driver doing that. Why would a driver do that? It goes against their own interests. He goes on. This will serve to prevent accidents such as the bus accident on Route 287 last year that killed several people. That driver may have been on duty for 18 hours. So, in other words, he's saying this is a good thing. There are already other onboard recording devices on trucks that she may not be aware of, or she would have complained about them. The regulations do not require video recorders in the cab, but individual owners may do so. If they do, it will serve to defend the company against claims of careless driving in case of an accident. Oh, he says here, I am the safety manager of a trucking company, and I support this regulation. Okay, so responses. Anybody wants to refute anything they heard on here? Feel free. I will sometimes read it. So what do we got? We got the two conventions coming up, and everything is a spectator sport. I expect that there's a lot of people not listening to me tonight because they're watching the Olympics, and I would be too. If it was a choice between listening to me and watching the Olympics, if I had that choice, I would switch me off and I would watch the Olympics. So there's probably a lot of people doing the Olympics are fascinating. I mean, we've already talked to people here on the air, and if you've been reading articles or if you're reading anything about it, you see that it's a gigantic business operation. And perhaps a sport second. You know, it used to be, when it first started out, it's a complicated thing. When the Olympics first started out, the modern Olympics in 1896, they restarted them. Obviously, they had Olympic Games in ancient Greece, and I don't know that much about it, but it's very likely that these games were participated in by various city-states in Greece. I don't know if they invited, the Persians or anybody else to come participate because they were all enemies and all fighting each other all the time. And even the Greek city-states, which were very large, well-armed city-states like Sparta and Athens, they were always at each other's throats too, of course. But still, they took a halt, and they had these games where people participated in discus throwing, javelins, whatever, chopping heads off, five-headed lions, whatever they did back then. And so it was a way, and this is the first time that anybody seemed to have known in recorded history, unless it happened in other places and I haven't read about it, but that I know of, where people who were used to being at each other's throats and who were having, had violent attacks on each other and sieges and starvation and, murder and everything else to see who was going to be the most powerful city-state. They took a break and they got together out of the love of sport and out of maybe some sort of unconscious understanding, unconscious on the parts of some people perhaps, that maybe people could just work it out on the field. I had a guy on a show I interviewed once, and there's a new book coming out called, or that has come out called America But Better. And it's a very funny book. If you like political satire, you should get this book. It's called America But Better. You can look it up on Google. And it's a satire written by a guy who's a former Marine, an American who now lives in Canada. And he co-wrote it with somebody else. In fact, they do stuff on YouTube. Check out put America But Better on your search thing there on Google, whatever it is, and you'll come up with a couple of YouTubes. They're very funny, and it's political satire, sort of like Colbert and Jon Stewart, only not as deliberately pointed and witty or as vicious. Kind of more laid back and sort of funny in a kind of a less stabbing way, in a less aggressive way. I like the more aggressive way, being an American, of course, and that's part of what the book is about. That Canadians and Canadian culture is essentially less violent and aggressive and less punitive and less judgmental as a whole than the American culture, and that's probably very true. But it's a funny book, America But Better. It's got a subtitle, and I don't remember the name of it. Maybe we can find out. And one of the authors, I could help you out with that too, his name is Chris Cannon, Cannon, Chris Cannon. Anyhow, so they wrote about this, and one of the things they're writing about, one of the suggestions was that all the crime in America, the gun violence and all the polarity here and all the vicious fighting that goes on here over every subject, and have we heard enough about it on this show? They're suggesting that we dump all of our other national sports and take up hockey, as Canada does for its national sport, because this is what they're suggesting, right? That hockey is one of, if not the most relentlessly vicious, brutal, physical game that people play as teams in the whole world. Bloody fights, stabbings with sticks, spearing, hooking, skates riding over people, banging people into the side glass of the rink so that they need $200,000 of face rearrangement surgery. I mean, this is really punch outs, banging into each other, concussions. But then he says, and the whole country focuses on hockey. It's like as if in this country there was only football. That's it. There was no basketball. There was no baseball, although most major sports are turning into more like football than they used to be. But there's no baseball. There's no football. Just pick one sport. If we only had one sport here, that's it. I guess once upon a time it was baseball, because baseball goes all the way back to even before the Civil War. So baseball, the national pastime, right? And no other sport. In hockey, that's it. I think they have a football league there, and it's something, but not much. And they had, at one time, I think 2 or 3 baseball teams, Major League Baseball teams, but maybe they have only 1 now or 2. I don't know how many. I know Toronto. Who's left there? Montreal? Toronto? I don't know. Anyhow. But hockey is the thing up there. Everybody in Canada is crazy about hockey, and they play it on the ice there because there's plenty of ice up there. Kids are brought up with it, and they're used to banging into each other and playing rough, to put it mildly. And he says, and this is something that psychologists have written about before, that these kinds of rough games get that violence, especially, of course, among young men. I mean, women play hockey too, but this is the point, that men are innately aggressive, or most men, I should say. Most men are innately aggressive. Some are astoundingly aggressive and even prone to violence. And but that when they all get together and play these games themselves, or go to the stadiums and watch these games, or watch them on TV, or when the players play, and people get vicariously involved in the millions. I mean, I think probably if the number of people who watch sports in this country was equal to the number of people who watch it over there, it would be twice as many as would watch it here. So he's saying we should be like that. We should have a national sport that is one. I guess football would be the one, right? What's the most violent sport, team sport in America? This is football, clearly. But hockey is worse if you've watched hockey on a more sort of everyday, relentless, variable basis. It's really violent. But violence is actually part of the game. Well, so it is in football, too, clearly. I mean, after all, you're tackling somebody or you're knocking somebody down. That's violent, right? But in hockey, it's even more violent. They deliberately have fights. There's no team sport that I know of in the whole world and in this country where people actually are allowed to fight. I mean, they get a penalty. They have to sit out for 5 minutes, which doesn't mean much, right? They get a timeout. Go to your room. You've been bad. You knocked a 6'4" man down and gave him a concussion. No dessert for you, right? Timeout. But there's nothing, there's no sport that has actual violence built into it or that people pay to come see. It's part of the game, right? The older I get, the less I like it. I used to, when I was younger, when I first started watching hockey, which wasn't all that long ago. But believe me, 15 years ago, I was about 40 years younger. So I was watching hockey. I got some thrill out of the fight. All my life when I've watched football and hockey, I got a vicarious charge out of watching these other guys smash the living shit out of each other. And why was that? I can't. Now, maybe you felt that way too, right? You got, and you want to admit it. First of all, it's not politically correct if you're on the left to admit, that you liked it. However, there are other reasons why people, I suppose, like that. I mean, people watch boxing. Oh, I forgot about boxing. Obviously, there's no more violent sport than boxing because it's all one big fight. And how could I forget about that? But as a team sport, anyhow, nothing more violent than hockey. So you watch these guys on a football field. Boom! They knock somebody out, and somebody's lying there, and they can't move. And then they got to bring the truck on. You don't like that. Nobody likes that, right? And it's this crazy, you would say dishonest, but it's not dishonest. It's just sort of psychologically disconnected scene where everybody is trying to, and these days, right, as we've all read in the newspapers, especially if you follow the sports page, people were being paid bounties by coaches, right? People were being paid bounties by coaches and professional teams. I think New Orleans was one of them, and other places, and maybe even some colleges, to cripple other players. In other words, they were giving guys who tackle other people, guys. What are the people who bring down the passers? What are they called? The defensive guys who go after the guys who are defensive backs, linebackers. They were paying these guys a bounty. It wasn't on the books, you understand, but they were paying them a bounty for hurting the guys on the other team. So forget about like a sporting chance or, let's see, may the best man win. No. This was cripple somebody so we can win, which is, of course, wrong in every possible way. It's not even economically feasible, right? Because you knock out all your best players. You got nobody left to play and the fans won't want to watch it. But, this violence was encouraged, and it's encouraged in hockey, too. So, I used to watch these guys knock the shit out of each other. And I guess the main reason I watched that was not because, maybe a little bit, because I was never somebody who got into fights. When I had a chance, I ran. I was a fast runner. I'm not going into my whole psychological history, but it wasn't that I was, when I was a kid, I was smaller than everybody else. When I got older, I was as big or bigger than the average person, right? And stronger, maybe. But I took off, and that had to do with the way I was brought up. Sort of like poor Barack. You know what I mean? Without any man at all, anywhere in the vicinity of my house or anywhere in my family, Nobody to teach me how to be like a man, which is to say at least stand up or stand up for yourself and stand there and give as good as you get. Not me. As soon as I saw an opening, I was gone, like the road runner, and save my ass that way. But, of course, I was cowardly. So I'd watch these guys smack each other, on the football field or in hockey, and I would get a thrill out of it. Like, that's what it's like to be a man, I thought, right? You stand up for yourself, and you get a concussion or a broken neck, and you can't play the rest of your life, or your knuckles don't work because they're splintered 4 ways, on the chart, and your elbow it gets jammed from hitting somebody so hard, or you have to get a new nose and a new eyeball, and that's what it means to be a man. Anyhow, I got something out of that, right? Then I got older, and I thought, well, who cares, man? This is ridiculous. And now when they fight each other in hockey, it makes me irritated, or I don't look at it, or I say, well, why are they wasting their time? How stupid. And I think how stupid men are, but specifically how stupid young men are, and how cynical old men are, like Cheney and other people like that, the Mr. Potters of the world, how cynical old men are for sending young men off to war. Young men want to fight. A lot of young men, they have a lot of hormones and, energy and aggression raging through them. They want to fight. They want to beat up on the bad guys. All they got to do is just point me to the bad guy, right? So you get leaders of a country like Cheney and all these other people, people who should know better. Some of them have been in wars, like Colin Powell, who's been in a war. People have been in Vietnam or whatever, the guys who sent people over to Iraq the first time and even the second time. I remember the guy who invaded, what was it? The guy who was in charge of invading Iraq the second time under little squeezy, weaselly George Bush, the son who invaded Iraq the second time. He, in 2003, Tommy somebody or other, he was the general then, and he had been in Vietnam. All those guys had been in a generation where they had been in Vietnam. And so there's some of them had been to war. But the real people who send people off to war, who lie to us, and who should be in jail for doing it, but aren't, but people like Cheney and other people of that generation and Bush, both of whom, by the way, talk about running like rabbits from the draft. Cheney avoided the draft 6 times. 6 times. He might have set a record. And when they asked him why he avoided the draft, he said, I had other things to do, more important things to do. But he didn't have more important things to do than send several 100,000 American soldiers over based on a lie to Iraq, and resulting in the death of hundreds of thousands of people, including several thousand American soldiers. That was okay. He didn't run from that one. What's to fear? So older men, and this is the story of history, boys and girls, older men throughout history, tyrants, men, for their own personal purposes or for power or for money, have sent young men off to war. And if you want to see an example of that, it doesn't focus on the political or psychological parts of it so much about older men, but what it's like to be a young man and to be brought up and to be told that if you want to fight for your country, you see that flag? The best one is Born on the 4th of July. Ron Kovic wrote this book, Kovic, Born on the 4th of July, and it's one of Tom Cruise made the movie of it, and it's one of the best roles he's ever played. And it'll tell you once and for all what it means. And there's a lot of movies like that. There's one of the best ones ever written, and certainly the first one ever written in the modern age, is All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front, which is it's just a tiny bit archaic at this point because it was written in the 1920s. I think it was written in the 1920s. And Eric Maria Remarque, his name is Eric Maria, I guess that was his mother's maiden name, or mother's name, Remarque, Remarque. Am I giving you too much information? Maybe some people record this show. Anyhow, All Quiet on the Western Front is the king, it's the daddy of all anti-war books. In fact, it's such a great anti-war book that the author, who was German and who fought in the war, was thrown out of Germany by the Nazis. He was also a writer of many other very good books. He was a great novelist. They threw him out of Nazi Germany because he wrote an anti-war book, which gives you an idea about how things stand, right? But all these people, whether or not they're in the war or even if they weren't, it's just more cynical and dishonest that they weren't, take advantage of this feeling in a lot of young men of wanting to fight for the team, right? Think of Penn State, right? To fight for the team, The team is America, Team America, right? To be patriotic. Look at the flag, stars and stripes forever, right? Now, sometimes the war is, you can't call any war a good war. But although that's the title of a book I read once by Studs Terkel, and it was about World War II, and it was called The Good War, although he was being ironic about it. There is no such thing as a good war. All wars are horrible. But somewhat as close as you can get to a righteous war is fighting against something like the Nazis, right? So people did have to fight they were literally fighting for democracy. There's plenty of complicated other attachments to this. They were fighting also for power and dominance in the world. They were fighting again for economics. If you read enough about it, you'll see it. But still, at least if you're being controlled by old men who want power over other people or who are running empires or countries, if you're going to be sent off to a war for their sake, better something like Roosevelt sent you off to fight the Nazis or even the Japanese Imperial Empire than what? The Viet Cong, then the Iraqis, then the Afghans, right? I mean, the Vietnamese in the jungle someplace. I mean, give me a break. That's got nothing to do with patriotism, and it has everything to do with money and power and this cynical manipulation of young men. So I don't know what it is about young men that have this urge. Is it a hunting instinct from ancient ancestors towards violence, banging into people? I grew up in New York City, and on the streets, everybody plays basketball, and it's the easiest, cheapest game to play, right? I mean, even if you want to play baseball, you got to have a glove and you got to have a bat and a ball. You want to play basketball, all you got to do is have a beat up old basketball, which, by the way, if you bounce it enough times on a concrete court in New York City, turns into a piece of cement. Remember that, right? A basketball, and if you get hit by that or you catch it the wrong way in your hand, forget about it, right? So you play basketball. Playing basketball on any court in New York City, on a school ground or something like that, is like playing football with a basketball. I mean, there's no referees in these games. Nobody's blowing any whistles, and if you make it anywhere near the basket to take a shot, you're lucky, and you've already got a few bumps and bruises. But so the whole idea of violence. And we're going to talk more about this kind of thing. I'm just sort of setting up a guest for after 6 o'clock. You channel this violence, and then if you've got a good coach, that is to say, a decent man who isn't into violence themselves or putting bounties on hurting other players, right? Or coaching, and telling you, I want you to run that guy down, or get your cleats into his leg, or give him an elbow in the face. I mean, if you have a decent man who's coaching, who isn't a pederast or a violent maniac, he'll tell you, we want to win, but we don't want to win at the cost of our souls or our morals or our decency. You want to just beat somebody at the game. If roughness is part of the game, yeah, okay. This is a fantastic phrase in football, which most of you know, called unnecessary roughness, which implies that, of course, there is roughness, and some of it is necessary as part of the game. If you've got a team that's opposing another team, and this works even for baseball, right? You got a team that's opposing another team. I mean, think of a player coming around third and coming in to the plate, and the throw is going home. How many times have we seen that, right? And the catcher gets it and has to stand in front of a guy who's 220 pounds running 25 miles an hour. Big guy with cleats on and elbow pads and whatever else coming right at him like a charging bull. I mean, there is necessary roughness in every game. And everybody who's ever played on the streets or played at school understands that, unless you went to some really liberal or politically correct private school somewhere where you couldn't even say boo to somebody, or they would send you home and make you sit in a corner or whatever. So meanwhile, hockey as the national game. Hockey is the national game. And so they all get together and they watch hockey, they play hockey, they have favorite teams. They beat the crap out of each other in addition to playing hockey. And if they play it well, it's a beautiful game to watch. And then everybody goes out and celebrates and gets together. They don't have, once in a while it happens, but they're not like soccer fans in Europe. It's a different thing. There are soccer fans all over the world, actually, but especially we've seen this in Europe, riots where people kill each other. There are mass wars. There are literal wars in the stands. I guess it doesn't work so well to watch people on a soccer field, which will also be pretty rough. The roughest game in Europe is rugby, which is really something. I mean, that's like football without any protection. Boom, bang into each other. But in hockey, up in Canada at least, the fans don't beat each other up in the stands. I mean, I've been to a hockey game where there were terrible rivals. It was the Devils, New Jersey Devils and the New York Rangers, who hate each other, right? Quote unquote, who hate each other. They don't really hate each other. But you're sitting in the stands and you got some guy with a big paunch and he's got a beer, he's got four beers, 12 beers, and he's got a gigantic shirt that says, fuck the Devils, that he made himself, right? A real wonderful American example. And he's sitting there with his little son, encouraging him. And, and you're right behind him or you're in front of him and you're saying, you're a Devils fan. So you're yelling, for the Devils. And people don't kill each other over this. They'll maybe have words or they'll yell at each other, but they don't kill each other over it. So there's something about the possibility. And then you see it in the Olympics. And that's where it really gets bizarre, right? Oh, I was talking once before. I don't want to leave things dangling. I have a new pledge. Don't leave thoughts dangling if you can help it. Okay, so I'll tie one up from before. In football, there's this weird disconnect, which is very strange. Everybody's trying to, smash the shit out of everybody else, to slow them down, to tackle them, to sack people, to bring people to the ground. And so what happens is somebody hits somebody really hard, and then there's somebody else, and then somebody's lying on the ground. And all of a sudden, everybody who's been trying to kill each other on each side is standing around kneeling and saying prayers. Everybody's been screaming literally from the stands, kill him, right, or cripple him, which people do. All of a sudden they're all aghast, and they're looking at the other guy who moments before they detested him. He was the arch villain, of the piece. Suddenly he gets hit a certain way, and you can just see it. His leg bends back funny, or his neck or something, and he's lying there unconscious. And your heart's in your throat. You look at this and you hope nothing happens to him. Meanwhile, 2 minutes before, you hope something, like somebody stepped on his head or something like that. So, and everybody's, and then so they picked this guy up off the field and they put him on one of those, carts, and they drive him off, and everybody stands up and applauds if he wave his arm, if that's all he can move, or if he limps off. It's a strange experience, right? I mean, how do you put those two things together? That you're rooting for somebody to literally get crippled practically, or to get brought down and not be able to get up, but then when he really can't get up, you're upset. I don't know what that's all about. So the idea here, but the main thing is the Olympics. That's where I started out talking about. Imagine that I actually figured it out, what I started talking about in the first place. Excuse me. The Olympics, we're going to go to a break in a minute. I'm going to have words with you. The Olympics started out with these city-states who were at each other's throats, who were trying to kill each other for power and for money and for glory or whatever. They put down their swords and their javelins and their knives and their bows and their arrows, and they get together, truce. It's the only time they had peace between each other, right? And they get together in a stadium, and they have these rough sports or other sports, and they see who's going to win. And then you say to yourself, then they go home, and they shake hands and, whatever. Then you say to yourself, when you're looking at this, right, you say, well, why don't we do this all the time? What's the sense of killing other people, of rape, murder, theft, cities burning down, misery for generations, fear, living in fear all the time, spending so much money on weapons and training and armies and armor and equipment and siege walls and everything else that you don't have money even to clean the streets or help anybody else. Sound familiar? What's the point of it? And now we're looking at almost every country in the world at the Olympics, and some countries are at war with each other or practically, or have border disputes, or are trying to crush each other, at least economically, if not every other way. And here they are, shaking hands, hugging each other, patting each other on the back, looking at each other. Maybe they don't like each other, but at least they're sporting, and they're competing their hearts out in all kinds of team sports, volleyball, whatever it is, soccer, everything else, or individual sports. The whole world comes together. Everybody sits there. Nobody's shooting anybody or stabbing anybody or trying to make deals behind each other's back to starve each other. They're just having it out on a field. Why can't we leave it at that? How about an Olympics every 6 months? Then we don't need all these fucking wars. Here's just a proposal, that's all. Anyhow, you know what? We need to take a break, and we've got some people on the phone. Anybody wants to call up about this? Chime in. Anybody wants to call up? It's 866-997-4748, because I'm running out of my voice here. Let's see. Okay, we'll take a break, and we'll come back, and we got one caller on the line. Anybody else wants to join them, feel free. Okay. Why are we not doing more to save our culture? Because we're watching reality TV, who is the biggest, strongest housewife that can actually have the most affairs and shoot her husband. That's why we're not saving our culture, because we have no more culture. Greg from St. Cloud, Michigan, you're on.
Minnesota.
I'm sorry. Minnesota. That's my fault.
Yep. Hey, thank you for taking my call. I think the examples you have given are spot on. And, what a difficult concept to get along with one another.
Mm-hmm.
But the point I want to make, this curriculum, our politicians are showing our youth of moral, both right and left. I just crack up. You send our men and women in uniform overseas to fight this war on terror. And these politicians single-handedly are destroying this country financially, and both right and left. And it just stirs me up inside to see what's happening nowadays under the Bush administration, the current Obama administration, and I just laugh. So these politicians sit here and play with one another while things continue to get worse, but have no problem on this war on terror and killing our men and women in uniform on a weekly basis, but single-handedly are going to bring this great country of ours to her knees because they can't figure monetary policy out.
Well, it's not only that. It's not only that American soldiers are dying. It's also obvious that we're fighting unwinnable wars, and a lot of innocent people over where we're killing people are dying too. It's all wrong in every way, and we spend trillions and trillions of dollars on it. The guy I was supposed to have on as a guest this first hour has written, and I might try to get him on another show, has written a tremendous article, which I can refer you to online. If you get in touch with me on my website, just get in touch with me. Go to Feder Files, FEDERFILES.com, and it'll give you a way to get in touch with me. And then I can tell you more information about this. It's about the fact that there are over 1,000 United States bases, several hundred of which we don't even know about. It's a hidden budget, and this is not a conspiracy theory. It's just, clear research that he did.
Right.
And he visited these bases. I don't know how he got to do it, but he did. And they're small bases, anywhere from several hundred Marines or soldiers to several thousand. And they're all over the world, in every place you could possibly imagine, encircling every country we think might be an enemy economically or in any other way. And there are hundreds of thousands of troops total, and this includes naval, basically floating naval bases, in the Persian Gulf and everything else. And we spend trillions of dollars that's not even accounted for. And then meanwhile, we have to have austerity. We got to change the age for retirement. It's inexcusable and criminal,
I totally agree with you. And, I have always said, whether you're right or left, something needs to happen here. We've got to come together. This division that we have in this country is absolutely insane.
The trouble is the trouble is come together under what banner or in what way?
I don't know the answer to that. I'll use myself as an example. If you want to raise my taxes a little more, I'm all for it. I'm willing to do a little more to help this country out, but at the same time, I don't want to see wasteful spending like you just described on our weaponry defense system here. And and until this division is figured out and people start coming together and working together like they used to do back in the day, people were united, and this country is so divided now. It's scary. And I look at, the debt of this country and our relations we have with other countries around the world, and this Wall Street fraud and corruption, You know.
Well, now you put your finger. You know, I'm going to have to move on. I got to move on and take some other calls. But there you put your finger on the main problem. The main problem is it's not a political problem. It's an economic problem. It's based on greed, which is the basic ruling credo of America. The fact that this president has been in office for 3.5 years and has not had his attorney general put one of these gangsters in jail, and these are the real criminals of the world. And he has not put one of them in jail, hasn't indicted one of them or arrested one of them, except a couple of mid-level guys, which means nothing. The head of all these major banks, Jamie Dimon and all these other guys, they should be doing hard time for the rest of their lives. But he hasn't even so much as sniffed funny in their direction. I got to move on.
Amen.
All right. Richard from Texas, you're on.
Yeah, it's called campaign contribution. That's why he hasn't done none. But another thing, too, the roughest sport in the world is bull riding. That's worse than any other sport. That's where you really get hurt at. And number three, I agree everything y'all said about all these illegal wars. We got to get out of the UN. That's what we got to get out of.
Well, what's the UN got to do? But the UN has nothing to do with our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
They're part of it. That's what we're fighting.
No. It's a NATO coalition. They have nothing to do with it.
Okay, well, I thought it was UN.
No. The UN, if it was the UN, we wouldn't be having these wars. The UN, they're more of a peace organization. It's NATO. It's the NATO. I'm sorry. What?
They're not causing any peace, man. They're not doing nothing about these conflicts, you know.
You got to look in. You're going to have to, Richard. You got to go look into this some more. The UN is one of the major organizations trying to promote peace, but they have their men on the ground in places. They get killed trying to put themselves in between people.
They gave George Bush permission to go in Iraq.
They didn't give him any permission. He went to the UN and he told them that unless he was stopped from doing it, he was going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, well, he should be.
They didn't give him permission to do it. The UN basically is a force for peace. You should study it more.
No, thanks for correcting me.
No, it's really. But the point here is that when we're talking about Afghanistan or Iraq, it's NATO. It's the North American Treaty Organization. It's basically European countries and a couple of others pitching. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thanks for calling, Richard.
Have a good one.
Sure. Let's go to Douglas in Virginia.
Hey, Mike.
Hey.
I listen to your show from time to time, and I agree with the caller before the last one about the monetary.
About the what? I'm sorry?
About the monetary policy.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And you agreed with him, and I agree with both of you guys. And I'm a right-winger, so... but what I do want to say is this about, you were saying about these wars, and we basically have been living in a wartime type economy where we reap the benefits or whatever, people at the top or whatever in the complex reap these benefits from it.
And the rest of us lose.
Well, and I think Ron Paul was trying to maybe obviously say something about it. He was
right.
Against it. I'm against it too. I pretty much supported Ron Paul. But my fear is this. You spoke about, stopping these conflicts, and I think they're winding them down. And what's scaring me is, we're coming up on September. Every single collapse, 33, the 70s, 08, they were in this country as well as other countries too. It always seems to happen in September. So here we are coming up on September. That other caller mentioned the monetary policy and the collapse that's coming. And you sounded like you agreed with that. We're sort of heading for what you called, I think, a fiscal cliff or something of that nature. And I guess what's scaring me is this. We're getting out of these foreign conflicts. They're going to bring these troops home. I've heard things about foreign troops, DHS ordering 500 million rounds of .40 caliber pistol ammo. So it's obvious to me, and maybe I sound paranoid, that they're getting ready for something in our country. It's obviously a fiscal collapse or some type of new crash that's going to happen. Hopefully not. Hopefully I'm wrong about this, but I kind of think that it's inevitable. They've been propping it up. So only question to me is if they have built these camps that, different people have talked about, some people retracted, some people are going on and on about that. I don't want to be too long-winded, but if this stuff is real, the only question is, okay, we're going to wind down these conflicts overseas. Well, who's going to get rounded up then in our country?
Well, I mean, this gets to be a complex issue, and as far as I know, there's been a lot of people talking about these FEMA or Department of Homeland Security joint concentration camps being built all over the place. I'm not sure I've seen enough proof to prove that. However, when you mention the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is buying up a lot of ammunition and supplying weapons to local police and state police, and also that the troops are coming home, and the President of the United States recently signed a Defense Authorization Act, which includes using the Army to patrol the streets of the United States to round up terrorists, and the only people who are terrorists are who he says are terrorists, then you got to worry about what's going to happen. We don't need an army even 1/10 the size of what we have. If they're going to come back to the United States and they're able to patrol the streets of our cities, you can forget about any protests that are going to happen.
I agree with that. You're right. The Posse Comitatus Act being basically repealed or gutted is what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a violation of the Constitution, but then also they're getting ready to roll out the domestic drones. I mean, maybe they're going to fit them with weapons at some point. I mean, what are we living in? We've got cameras.
I know. I mean, it almost makes you despair. You just have to keep going on. But I mean, really, the militarization of the government. I mean, basically, they consider any citizen who even so much as objects to something that they're doing as a terrorist now. So, and you're in a lot of trouble. They could just lock you up. I'm going to move on and take another call.
Thanks.
Okay, Henry from Cincinnati, you're on.
How y'all doing?
Hey.
Look, I've been hearing a lot of you guys calling about theories, conspiracies, and stuff. But bottom line to me, and it's just to me, the issue that we really need to be talking about, you touched on a little bit earlier. They need to go ahead and take these banks from the private individuals, and really just the government go in and take the banks over.
Oh, I agree completely. I think the only answer is to nationalize the banks only.
Yeah, because right now, the way the banks are doing right now, they're totally irresponsible with all the money they are gathering. They sit up there gathering up all this money and then divide it up among their CEOs, and then they tell everybody else, well, we don't have the money that you want for us to lend out because, you all are risk. Like, you're not the risk or the one taking all the money from the big bonuses and everything else, and then you're going to give your bank a bad rating where, according to whatever that group is that comes into the bank and see if it's able to hold up again.
Moody's.
Keep fucking.
Moody's.
This is crazy, and everybody coming with all these conspiracy theories with all these other things going on. Let's take care of the one center problem, and then you can take care of the other problem. The main problem issue we have right now throughout the whole world, not just the United States, throughout the whole world, is a financial institution.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And the problem is
I agree.
that right now they are buying the elections. They getting all these other things passed where they can get away with pretty much murder, but nobody is doing anything about it because everybody acts like they're scared to touch them. As far as I'm concerned, hell, throw a match to them, burn them down to the ground. Let's start over.
All right, thanks for calling. Let's go to, I don't know who it is in Pittsburgh. Greg? Yeah. Greg, you're on.
Hey, Mike.
Hey.
Yeah, I was listening to you talk about, different issues, and I called you last month ago. We got into it about your music, and I guess I'm going to jump on your books. We need protests, and we need about 20 million white people to stand up and say enough of this. And until that happens, we're just going to keep going round and round. Everybody knows what the problem is. I listen to all these channels. Everybody knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I see it, man, the white male, and I remember months ago when they were talking about, the whole terrorist thing was going on. They were saying that, the Muslims need to identify the small minority in their religion that's acting crazy and do something about it. Well, you guys need to recognize the small minority in your population and do something about it and stand up.
Well, a lot of us are trying to do something about it.
I'm talking about doing something real. I mean, you look at these other countries, and
what would something real be?
Well, we getting carbon copies of it almost for about 4 or 5 different times over the last couple of years in Syria and Egypt. They just went to the streets and all this.
I'm with you on that. I'm part of a generation that actually did go to the streets and help stop a war. I don't know where the people are now that aren't going into the streets. I went to the streets.
And I'm glad you did, but why can't they do it again?
I don't know. You got to ask them. They're all 20 and 30 years old. What are they doing?
I just don't understand. The books that you cited earlier.
Yeah.
Born on 4th of July. And all these great authors and whatnot. I mean, what is that all good for?
What's it good for? Did you ever read a book?
Of course, I've read a book.
Did you get inspired by a book? Did you ever get inspired by a book?
Well, I mean, what is it really inspiring, to talk about it or to take action?
To take action. What do you think? Well, if you people who read books like that,
we haven't taken action in about 50 years.
And you know why? Because people don't read books anymore.
Well, you got me on that one.
Well, I'm not trying to get you. I'm just trying to say it like it is. That's why people don't, because they're not being inspired by anything. Because all they're doing all day long is jerking off on their little texting machines.
You're right. Yeah, and I just don't understand it. I mean,
well, listen,
this is not gonna change. I mean, all this talking and all these news shows and all these blogs. I mean,
I got to go right up against the end of the hour here. So.
All right, Mike.
All right. Okay, that's it. That's all we got for all the time we got for this hour. We'll be back after the 6 o'clock news to talk about the fictitious lone gunman theory. We are all the lone gunmen here. There is no such thing as a lone gunman. America is a lone gunman. All right, we'll be back.
It wasn't an Olympic event, but some skydivers in northern Illinois set a record.
All right! Come on! Let's do this!
They did it. At speeds of up to 220 miles an hour, nearly 140 skydivers shattered the vertical skydiving world record. They flew heads down in a massive snowflake formation. One of the organizers explained vertical flying is basically doing a handstand in the air. Ed Donahue, AP Radio News.
Okay, so you see Americans are still involved in very serious things. The massive joint skydiving record was just shattered. So lest you think that this country isn't involved in very important things, think again. All right, we're going to talk a little bit, building on what we were talking about earlier, about the whole idea of violence and societal violence, not just this lone gunman idea. We're going to talk with Chip Burley. Am I saying your name right finally?
Yeah, Chip Burley, you got it.
Got it. All right, good. So you've been on enough times.
Yeah, really.
Okay. So Chip Burley, we're going to talk about an article he wrote recently, and this is something he's concentrated most of his career on, is hate groups, violence, that kind of thing in America. And let me just refresh you about Chip Burley. Is an investigative reporter, independent scholar, photographer, and progressive activist specializing in the study of right-wing movements in the United States. And his byline has appeared in publications ranging from the New York Times to The Progressive. He is a frequent guest on radio and television programs, et cetera, et cetera. Burley has also written scholarly articles on conspiracy theories, religious apocalyptic aggression, that's really something, and organized racist groups. For 30 years, he was a senior analyst at Political Research Associates, and he is co-author of Right-Wing Populism in America, Too Close for Comfort. And he's also a vice president of the Defending Dissent Foundation. So maybe, would it be all right with you if I read the first paragraph and then we went into the article?
Oh, sure.
Is that okay? Okay. And this is by Chip Burley, and this is recently after the shooting out in Colorado. In Friday's Colorado movie theater shooting rampage, the suspect is described as a lone wolf terrorist. What does that mean? How does it fit into the overall picture of terrorism as portrayed in the corporate media? Media coverage of domestic terrorism is not covering the whole story. Since the election of President Barack Obama, there have been a series of deadly terrorist incidents in the United States, some clearly politically motivated, others more obscure, in which individuals have reached the breaking point and acted out in violence, often cloaking themselves in the armor of a delusional superhero complex, which we'll talk about later in more depth, in which they are a hero or anti-hero for their terrorist attacks. The claim of mental illness in a terrorist is often used incorrectly and sometimes used to dismiss any societal motivating factors in a violent act. And there we have, on that is based a long tail, right? I mean, first of all, the man is in a theater shooting. We don't even know anything about what he has to say or who he is yet, and we may never know, how, depending on how gone he is. But there he is, the lone gunman, perhaps rehearsing some kind of fantasy he has where he's avenging something or rescuing something we don't really know in a movie theater where they're showing a movie watched by the whole world and this country about a man who is avenging and rescuing people by himself, more or less. Right?
Right. So okay, it's let's go. I'll give you a list of things real fast, and we can talk about it.
Yeah.
One is you can't diagnose a person as mentally ill from news media reports. Number two, mentally ill people are no more violent than anyone else in the country. And three, here's a clincher. Some mentally ill people who act out in violence are nonetheless influenced by real events in the political, social, or cultural scene. And you know, you can look back at John Salvi in Massachusetts, who shot and killed people at reproductive rights centers, and Jared Lee Lohner in Arizona, who picked Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, and Major Nadal Hassan, a Muslim man, killed 13 and wounded 32 at Fort Hood. These are people who are arguably suffering from a diagnosable mental illness. But they didn't go out and, you know, shoot up a McDonald's, or they didn't go out, and not that I'm recommending it, go or shoot up a pizza place. You know, they sometimes mentally ill people who act out in violence pick a target because of reasons that make sense to them and are influenced by the scene around them in the society. And the other thing is that some terrorists aren't mentally ill at all, like the folks who blew up the Oklahoma Federal Building, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. They weren't mentally ill at all. They were political soldiers.
Well, now,
often called crazy, however.
But that's a point that you have to sort of think about in maybe a larger and larger context. I mean, anybody who actually murders hundreds of total strangers or dozens of total strangers is in a way crazy, right? No, you don't think so?
Obnoxious, horrible, out of control, but not crazy. Crazy, if you want to say crazy and you mean mentally ill, then it's absolutely not true. If you want to say crazy and mean, you know, just not rowing with both oars, that's also not true.
Well, I think if we focus in on specific mental illness diagnoses, which you do refer to in your and we'll talk about that. But maybe there's a word that I'm looking for that connects all these things. As you're talking about, for instance, you use this phrase in here, signs of something toxic spreading the fumes of anxiety through our society, that they are the mind canaries, you know, et cetera. So basically, if we have something in society which is disconnected, which is, I mean, there are certain ways that sort of you could approach a kind of sort of mass mental illness, right? The idea of, let's say you have tens of millions of people in this country who don't believe in global warming, or who believe that the Earth is created in 7 days. Now, what word would you're a polite guy, obviously, I'm not. What word would you use to describe that group of people or that belief?
Stupid.
Stupid. So we're not talking about crazy. We're talking about stupid. Okay, I just want to get the terms right.
I get it.
Okay.
You
know what I'm saying? You know, yeah.
I mean, there's a whole series of books that have come out in recent years about these cognitive issues where if you believe something really strongly and you're presented with absolute documentable scientific evidence that your belief is wrong, it just makes you have a stronger belief. Which, you know, it's kind of a gag if you're trying to say, well, we can have rational debate and it'll cure everything. Well, it turns out it doesn't. So there's two things happening in American society. One is a lot of people are extremely stressed out for a variety of reasons, not just because the economy still is in the tank for a lot of people, but also just, you know, changing gender roles, changing racial demographics. There's just a lot of stress. And in a society that's under a tremendous stress and not being dealt with as a society in a community kind of way, people break and they snap and they do things like turn to violence or commit suicide or, you know, go up on the mountain and wait to be raptured.
Well, if we're talking about something like this, for instance, if I was this guy's lawyer, Holmes, right?
Right.
Now he may get diagnosed as having severe mental illness,
right?
But in some cases where people don't get diagnosed this way, or let's say maybe can conduct their own court defense, or really they know who the governor is or what day it is, these standard tests, right?
Right.
I would still, if I was the lawyer, I would claim temporary insanity. You know.
Well, you could welcome to do that. It's, you know, part of the legal system in the United States allows you to do that. But that usually is brought on by an incredible stressor, like your mom died, you wrecked your car, and your girlfriend or boyfriend left you.
You got fired, you lost your house, you got sick,
and you just snapped, right? Mm-hmm. And so temporary, that form is actually quite rare in terms of terrorism. Mm-hmm. And I'm certainly going to argue that what happened in Colorado was an act of terrorism.
Oh, really? Would you?
Oh, sure.
So terrorism, I guess we want to get our terms, agreed upon here. Terrorism, as it's generally understood, and I don't mean by people who are whipping up another war or idiot people in the media who want us to fight a war, but terrorism is when a group of people use violence to achieve a political purpose, right?
Not necessarily a group, an individual or group use violence against non-combatants to achieve a political goal. And I would argue that individuals, groups, and countries can engage in terrorism.
Well, we're engaging in terrorism.
Wildly unpopular in some circles.
Oh, well, we're certainly, you can say the United States with its drone attacks and missiles and
There
invasions.
are a number of countries around the world that have historically engaged in terrorism. We just don't like to look at it.
Well, I mean, even
what it is.
Even the bombings in World War II, I mean, without getting, to kill 100,000 people in Tokyo or Dresden or whatever is terrorism, But
we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then we carpet bombed Dresden and other cities in acts which today in international law would be called terrorism.
Well, what about
did we end the war sooner? Oh, sure, but that's not the criteria for morality, is it?
So the people who flew the plane or the planes into the World Trade Center were political terrorists, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
arguably not insane. They were political soldiers.
I wouldn't have. I'm with you on that one. But are you saying that this guy Holmes may have been or is a political terrorist?
We don't know yet. I guess what the whole point of my essay was saying, people are making assumptions about what they know about this person that may or may not be true. And then in the essay I lay out, all right, sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes we may not ever know whether Holmes has an articulable political goal. But we do know that some people, like John Salvi, who and here's an irony, John Salvi was found fit to stand trial. Now, I have to say that both the defense and the prosecution in the John Salvi case came to me as an expert in this area, and at one point I had them at different tables in the library where I worked looking at the documents that you clearly showed where John Salvi got his ideas from. They were ultra-right-wing Catholic documents about a vast conspiracy, not from the Vatican, I assure you. Mm-hmm. This was a fringe Catholic right-wing group, and he had read their materials and had talked to his family and neighbors and friends and others about his political views. He was also, I think, mentally ill, and that was debated by two psychiatrists in court. He was found not mentally ill. He was convicted, sent to prison where he hanged himself.
Mm-hmm. The man who flew the plane into the government building was an IRS building?
Yeah, exactly. And there's an example of someone who snapped.
Yeah.
And there's an example of, you could say, was he mentally ill? I don't know. It's hard to diagnose someone who's dead. But you can say, and it's clear that in this country with tremendous stress, that there have been a number of political acts of violence, politically motivated acts of violence.
Can you name some others?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the most interesting is the number of acts of violence that occurred after Obama was picked as the candidate. And actually, within the 9 months of his taking office, there were some 20 deaths carried out by politically motivated terrorists, some of whom you can argue were mentally ill and some of whom were clearly not.
These are acts by people just against random citizens.
Well, obviously, I'm going to argue that Jerry Lee Loughner was mentally ill when he shot Congresswoman Giffords, but he didn't pick some person walking down the street.
Mm-hmm. He picked somebody who was the closest representative of the government that he could find, right?
Right, and the person who flew the plane into the IRS building picked the government, and the well-known neo-Nazi who walked into the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. and killed a guard and shot other people obviously was politically motivated.
And what about the man who shot the doctor that was in Kansas, the abortion doctor?
Right. There's an example, a long history of anti-abortion violence, which anti-abortion violence and violence by right-wing militia and further out types. And by militia, I'm not saying they're not card-carrying members because they generally don't have cards, but the patriot militia, right-wing, Obama is a socialist, and tyranny is coming crowd, that there are far more incidents involving those people since about 2010 than incidents involving radical violent Islamists who have carried out acts of violence in the U.S. So if you look at who the government looks at all the time, it's Muslims and ecological rights activists and animal rights activists who tend actually, I would point out, not to try to kill people. So the whole frame is wrong. There's a bias in the reporting where the government and the media like to look at Muslims and animal rights activists and ecology activists as the main terrorist threat in the United States, when in fact it's not. It's members of right-wing breakaway movements that see Obama bringing tyranny any moment now. Well, look at your watch. Time is running out. Let's act now before it's too late.
Well, some of these people who are defined as eco-terrorists, and we're not the only ones. The Canadians are now, clamping down and defining people as terrorists who oppose any kind of, oil pipeline or anything like that. They're actually passing laws like that. And in this country, but I think what you get here is people calling people eco-terrorists who are trying to actually put their bodies in front of trucks that are destroying the, stuff like that, or actually who are, in fact, did you ever read Edward Abbey's Monkey Wrench Gang?
Yes.
Right. There are people who are ecologically passionate, who don't want the earth and the air to be destroyed, and the people and the nature and the wildlife who will, try to destroy the machinery of actually doing that. Right?
There's no doubt about that, and that's vandalism, and it's criminal. Let's talk about three terms here that get smooshed together too much.
Okay.
Because I personally don't think that Gandhi and Martin Luther King were terrorists. So there is nonviolent civil disobedience.
Right.
Okay. There's vandalism. And there's terrorism.
Okay, and terrorism is
three different things.
Terrorism is if people are hurt, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And vandalism.
And in theory, and this is an argument that if you blow up a building that's empty, it's still an act of terrorism.
Well, that happened in the '60s with the Weather Underground.
Right. So those were acts of terrorism. They were political acts of terrorism. They were claimed at the time by the perpetrators as acts of terrorism against the state. So, again, there's too much looseness in the language.
And as far as let's work our way through this essay a little bit. Here, let me read this a little bit. A lone wolf terrorist, and this is something people talk about, the lone gunman, the lone wolf. And you notice, like you say, of course, as you point out, that the media will always immediately jump on all these people as a nut or a lone wolf, as if they didn't represent either other political movements or groups, or even, I'll go so far as to say, the whole idea of violence in American society, but that's another discussion, or a continuation of the same discussion.
Well, it's part of the same discussion. You're quite right.
I mean, after all, Batman, we're looking at this, the irony is beyond description. Batman is a man who, after all, he's righteous, and he goes against bad guys by using what? Extraordinary violence, right?
Yeah.
And fear and terror.
Right.
Yeah.
And self-appointed. I mean, he has no law enforcement cachet there.
No, he's but it's always been like that. Look at the whole history of America. The Lone Ranger. I listened to the Lone Ranger on the radio. I go that far back, and then on TV. Right? It's always that American icon, the Western hero, straight from all the way back. God knows what was leather stocking tales in the 1700s or the 1800s. Right. All the way up to Rambo, Clint Eastwood, Shane. It's always the guy who rides into town, who has no family, who has no roots, who has no connection to anything, who may in fact be a bad guy or a good guy, blasts a few people, solves, quote unquote, the problem, and takes off again. This is an American.
It's America. It's America. That's our myth. And you can even have westerns where there's a more communitarian aspect, like High Noon, which I urge people to watch, because in that one he's not masked. he has friends and he has roots in the community, and the community doesn't back him up, and then a handful of people disobey the common wisdom and help him fend off an attack by criminals. So even in the Western, there is an example of a different vision than the masked, armed, I'm going to take the law into my own hands and solve the problem, which is the superhero syndrome.
But the superhero syndrome and this, I'm going to take the law into my own hands, and it has, you and I are of a certain generation, but you are aware, no doubt, because you study these things, that the biggest seller for video games in the country, and there was an article just in the Times the other day about how it's extremely sexist, to say the least, is these single shooter. Here again, we have the single shooter games where some kid, usually a teenage boy, right? And the teenage boy, I'm talking about people from between 14 and 40, sits down at a console, and individually just blows the living crap out of people, and there's blood all over the place. And these games sell billions of dollars a year,
Right, and it appeals to, kind of a primal urge that in civilized societies one would hope we would, ameliorate in some way.
Here, let me read something in your article. A lone wolf terrorist is a person who has no current or past ties to an organized group or advocating political violence. Such people are very hard for government authorities to track. Thus, their acts of terrorism are almost impossible to stop. And here, the lone wolf uses a form of terrorism called leaderless resistance. Can you talk about what that is?
Well, leaderless resistance was an idea actually developed by a person involved in what became the CIA, who was looking at cell structures after the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe. And what was happening was...
You're talking about political cells, just to make
political
that
cells, yes,
right.
I'm sorry, not biological cells,
okay.
although the concept is actually related to little cells grouping together. So that you have these covert cells of individuals who were involved in espionage and acts of terrorism against the Soviet Union, which, I imagine a lot of listeners would applaud. In some circumstances, I think they were well-deserved, especially in some of the Eastern European countries. So what you have, however, is that in a totalitarian society under Stalin, the police are everywhere. They're reporting. Your friends are turning you in. And so the traditional cell structure wasn't going to work because it was too easy to unravel. So the idea was that you would use mass communications or mass media, and this was used by the resistance, the anti-Nazi resistance, where somebody in England broadcasting during a radio program would say, which 11, the fox is loose. And that meant to the French underground, go blow up a train in, Versailles. So basically, leaderless resistance says the exhortation for violence comes in a way that is not physically connected to the individual or individuals who carry it out. Now, if you read popular crime literature and terrorism literature, you will see it frequently referred to as the main form of terrorism in the United States is leaderless resistance. And in fact, it's not. Almost all of the politically motivated acts of terrorism in the United States are carried out by people who either have been or are in extended political networks, and
which tend to be
nothing to do with leaderless resistance.
And they tend to be structured in an authoritarian, even, right?
Well, they're structured in a hierarchical way, and
right.
there's an analyst, an anti-terrorism analyst working for the government, Simpson Garfinkel, who has done whole studies where he says, look, no matter how many times you read in the newspaper that this leaderless resistance is a wave of violence in the United States, it's just not true. But it sounds really sexy to say leaderless resistance instead of, incompetent terrorists.
Well, although they're not terrorists, of course the media and the right wing would love you to believe they are and have tried to do a good job painting that way. The Occupy movement, such as it was and maybe such as it may be again, one of their biggest points was, that they did not have a structure or hierarchical structure. They were, they were horizontal.
They were horizontal, but they were grouped. And so it was a fascinating social movement. I hope it's still around because it was pretty exciting to watch them develop democratic forms of leadership on the spot. But it was, in fact, a form of nonviolent civil disobedience, and overwhelmingly, and I visited a bunch of Occupy camps, and overwhelmingly the sentiment of the folks there was not to engage in acts of violence at all, and people who were violent or talking about violence were asked to leave. So to characterize Occupy as violence would be to characterize a nun sitting down in the street to protest, poverty as an act of terrorism. It's just absurd.
Well, it's absurd, of course, to people who are thinking and who are reasoning and who want to pay attention to the advancement of humanity. It's not absurd to most of the media and interested government parties, right?
Well, that's, I think, exactly the point of what I was trying to say in the essay, was that what we think we know about terrorism and violence is often simply not factually accurate.
Mm-hmm. And so this other issue that you brought up, and you do write a lot about it in the article. By the way, if you're just tuning in, we're listening to Chip Burley, who is one of the premier researchers and investigators on right-wing hate groups and violence in the United States. And he's talking to us about an essay he wrote that I read on Alternate. Was it written somewhere else or just on Alternate originally, or what?
It was written for Alternate.
Okay.
And it's out there floating around.
Well, where could, by the way, before I ask you another question here or two about the article, where can people go to find out, other articles that you've written or about you?
Oh, Research for Progress. I actually have a Mike Fetter link up on there right now to take you to a webpage I'm actually working on, not as we speak, because that would be wrong. But
no, it would be wrong. It would be an act of terrorism.
It would be an act of insult to you, Mike. I stopped working on it when you called. But I'm putting together a list of some of the acts of violence that have occurred from right-wing groups. Again, we're talking about a much broader discussion, but researchforprogress.org.
Okay, researchforprogress.org. So just one question related to what you just said. I mean, in this country, I'm just talking about in this country right now, are acts of violence overwhelmingly or predominantly right-wing rather than left-wing?
Let's start with the easy to do one. In the last few years, and especially since 2009, 2010, in the acts of violence that resulted in physical injury, much more been carried out by resistance groups on the political right and individuals who were afraid of Obama than any other type of group, and it far outnumbers acts of violence that resulted in injury by Muslims.
Well, what about if we go back, if we skip 9/11, just skip 9/11 and go back 10, 20 years, how does it stack up then?
Well, it comes and goes. I mean, obviously, during the period of the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were more acts of violence by leftists than rightists.
Right.
Although they were not absent from the list, there was a militia-type armed militia group called the Minutemen that engaged in acts of violence. So, and then you look at the Ku Klux Klan, and in earlier time, we're well aware of the lynchings, but we forget there were 5 different episodes of the Klan in the late 1800s and the 1920s, and all the way up through the Civil Rights Movement, and then post-Civil Rights Movement, a much more armed, militant form of the Klan emerged. So it comes and goes. I think throughout U.S. history, it has tended to be people on the right who have created more acts of violence that injured or killed people.
Could you
of political terrorism?
Could you venture a reason why?
I don't know. I think it's probably complicated, and I haven't ever figured it out.
Well, you sound like the rabbi when I ask him, about the God. He says, "Who knows? It's a mystery."
It's a mystery. That's why you call it a faith.
Let's
move. If it wasn't a faith, it wouldn't be a religion. Get over it.
Yeah, right. Okay. Absolutely. I remember I had my period on the radio where I tried to apply reason to faith. What a joke. Okay. In your article here, and you mentioned this before, it's one of the main parts of the article, or the essay that you wrote. You're talking about a couple of researchers. I think it was Vaughn Bell and Sina Fezel.
Yeah, there's a couple of studies that have been done that are pretty interesting.
This is about mental illness and violence, right? Okay. Can you explain this a little bit?
Well, it's basically, a lot of people have the idea that if you're mentally ill, you're just completely bonkers, to use a technical term. And in fact, sometimes you can be mentally ill and yet be influenced by the world around you. Mm-hmm. And so the assumption that someone who is mentally ill, who engages in an act of political violence or terrorism, is not motivated by some outside stimuli that the rest of us recognize as real is false. Now, it's entirely true that some people who are profoundly schizophrenic in a particular way, who engage in violence, it is difficult, if not impossible, to figure out exactly what they're talking about, other than the creature living in the ceiling told me to do it.
Yeah, like the Son of Sam, that kind of thing.
Right. And so, if God or creatures in the ceiling are telling you to go out and kill people, it's pretty safe bet that, you can't say, oh, well, they're motivated by this TV show or whatever.
Right.
If the TV show motivates you, that's one thing. If the TV show is sending you personal messages to do something, then that's probably a sign that points to mental illness.
And what if Bill O'Reilly gets on the radio numerous times and mentions a particular doctor in Kansas, I think it was, and says that he should be removed or put out of the way, or some other euphemism, which obviously means killed, and then somebody kills him? Is he somehow responsible?
He's not legally culpable, but he's morally responsible. And I've written about that people who exhort to violence and then claim, oh, I didn't really have any connection to the act of violence that occurred, are immoral. We have a word for it. It's immoral. It was studied, in fact, by Hannah Arendt in looking at the kind of rhetoric that Hitler used in Nazi Germany about the Jews, where the demonization and the scapegoating leads people in a particular direction. And I played with it at the beginning of the show, which is time is running out. These people are wholly evil. It's either us or them. We need to act before it's too late. And anything we do because they're so evil is justified. Now, when you set that up, you can end up with the death of a Dr. Tiller, or you can end up with a genocide. And it's only a matter of degree, because the paradigm, and I have an article coming out in Extra, the newspaper, the magazine of fairness and accuracy in reporting, where I talk about this as the classic paradigm of demonization and scapegoating, where if people are not like us, they're plotting against us, they're liars, they threaten the real community. And then you have the self-appointed hero, the superhero type, who says, I don't know why other people aren't acting. I'm going to do this act, and it'll show that we need to stop this evil force. Now, I first began studying this in a neighborhood in Chicago where my wife and I lived, where there were fire bombings of black families' homes and apartments. And at first, I thought it was this is, only in the United States. And we live in the Market Park area. Actually, it's a collection of neighborhoods on the southwest side. It's where Martin Luther King led an open housing march in the 60s, and somebody throws a bottle or a brick and hits him, and it's a very famous scene. That was our neighborhood. And there was actually a Nazi headquarters, a neo-Nazi headquarters, that flew a swastika flag in our neighborhood. And I was going to be the great researcher who moved into the neighborhood and figured out exactly how the Nazis and the Klan and the racist skinheads were carrying out the violence. And it turned out they weren't. It turns out that they would hold rallies, in their little uniforms and in their little hoodies, with the pointy white hats. And at night, a teenage boy would go out and fill up a bottle with gasoline and do the firebombing. Now, was that, in fact, an act of leaderless resistance? Yeah, it actually was. And what was fascinating to me was that it became clear that the leader of the neo-Nazi movement in Chicago understood this dynamic and played it for all it was worth. And eventually, the city police sent a team of arson investigators down, and they cracked it pretty fast, because they also knew that's what was happening. And that was one of the really first lessons I had as a researcher and an activist, to not make assumptions about who's doing the violence. And then this relationship between the exhortation to heroes who knew what needed to be done, and the act of violence, which is exactly what you have with anyone on the radio or television who consistently demonizes a group and scapegoats it for all of the problems. That is putting a target on somebody's back.
If I get on the radio, which unfortunately, perhaps, or even for whatever, for better or for worse, I get on the radio and I'm always talking about how, say, oil companies are destroying. I'm just reporting. I'm not Fox News. I report, you decide. I'm just. If BP is poisoning the Gulf and actually poisoning animals and destroying millions of dollars worth of jobs and industry and everything like that, and if I say to people, it's just sometimes I wish somebody would, before these drilling rig ships left port, somebody would blow them up. And then somebody went and blew one up and said, I listen to him all the time and he makes sense. I thought I'd do it. Is it my responsibility?
Sure. It's partly, a little bit, at least a little bit.
So I should watch the way I talk on the radio, right?
Well, yeah. Anyone who is in the mass media needs to be aware of this very simple fact that some people listening, if you say it's, that person should be taken out or that company needs to be destroyed, you have to understand that once or twice saying this is not going to add up. But if there's this litany over and over again pointing to a particular individual or in a particular group, and you can see it happening in all kinds of venues. You can see it happening in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of politics, in terms of ethnic identity, in terms of national origin, and the probably the most obvious forms that you can see on the web is you look at the portrayal of Japanese during World War II.
Oh, sure.
And it becomes almost tragicomedic in terms of how they're portrayed in images. In this article coming out in Extra, I contrast the portrayal of Jews as evil entities with the current portrayal of Muslims as evil entities, the other that must be stopped at any cost. And that, as different as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is, and they're actually quite different, the one thing that they share is the representation of Jews and Muslims by their enemies is profoundly distorted and savage.
Well, even visual images. Well, I grew up in the 50s. I don't know how old you are, but I grew up in the 50s, and we read comic books in the 50s. This is right after or during the Korean War. And what we saw was there was a comic book called Black Hawk, which you may not remember. It was a minor comic book, but he had a group of Avengers. They all wore black, and who knows, they hung out together. It's probably, maybe they had gender problems, but whatever. But they're all guys who wore black and spent all their time. Actually, I think they threw a woman in later because they wondered maybe something was wrong. But they were basically fighting the commies, right?
Right.
And they had constant pictures of Koreans who basically looked like giant, rabid rodents with these big buck teeth and this yellow and red. They had red eyes and yellow skin, and they looked like they were going to eat people all the time.
They're not like us. They're dangerous.
And it's the same thing as the Nazis did with the Jews, with this distorted visual images, right?
That's right.
So to let you a little bit off the hook, you say it once in a while, it's not a big deal. But if there's a societal effect, in other words, it's cumulative. It's like oysters accreting on a rock. It's not one incident. It is the litany, the repetition over and over, which sets up the dynamic. Well, the worst I ever saw, really, that I've been aware of at least, is O'Reilly with his countless attacks on one particular doctor in one place. I mean, to me, he's almost part of a conspiracy to murder.
Well, I agree, and I've said that, and it's not a legal issue it's a morality issue. It's the sense that you should know that if you paint this person in those terms, that you are in fact painting a target on their back.
Well, he knows that. I mean, and look at Ann Coulter. Ann Coulter makes a very good living going around and speaking at venues, at colleges. She writes books, and she'll say things like they should blow up the New York Times building.
Right, or, we need to invade their countries and convert them to Christianity.
I mean,
Right, and she's I've heard her speak at conferences I go to cover right-wing reality, and even in those venues, she's venomous to the point where there were people in the audience sort of shrinking a little back, saying, whoa, even people who support Sarah